On a quiet winter night in February of 2008, a 6-year-old by the name of Mattia Oxley was sleeping quietly in her bed when all of a sudden she woke up to the sound of a shadowy figure creeping into her room. Alyssa lay perfectly still as she watched the shadowy figure creep a little bit into her room, and then it stopped. And it almost looked like it was looking at her for a few seconds before it just turned and backed away. So for a few minutes, Alyssa's just laying there looking around, wondering if she had imagined it or if there was actually somebody in her house. She didn't really quite know what to think. So Alyssa's just lying there, not really knowing what to think of what that shadowy figure might have been, when all of a sudden she hears the sound of a shotgun blast going off down the hall towards her parents' room. Alyssa was terrified when she heard this, thinking that there might be an intruder in the house, and she just lays there for a couple of minutes not knowing exactly what she should do. But then she's relieved a couple minutes later when her mother comes into the room to pick her up. But as she's climbing up out of her bed into her mother's arms, she realizes that her mother's skin and most of her clothes are covered in blood. Thank you for watching another episode by Storyvolt. Just so you know, I post stories like this one here on a weekly basis, so if you're a fan of true crime, mysteries, and strange occurrences, please like this video, subscribe to my channel, and share it with a friend. And now that you've done so, let's open the vault. This is the story of Ben Oxley. Ben Oxley was born in 1972. His family and those who knew him described Ben as a spirited, loving, outgoing, and giving person. Ben grew up on the island of Hawaii and grew up loving the ocean and water sports like surfing, jet skiing, and other outdoor activities. And on top of all of this, Ben was an intelligent young man who had a lot of ambition and clearly had a bright future ahead of him. After graduating from high school in 1990, Ben went on to work at a hotel chain for nearly 15 years on the island of Hawaii where he had grown up. But when Ben was in his early 30s, he decided to move off of the island of Hawaii because he wanted to broaden his horizons, and in his own words, he wanted to experience life. Ben would end up settling down in the small town of Minden, Nevada, which is a few miles outside of Reno in the Sierra Nevada mountains near Lake Tahoe. He got a job working for a heating and air conditioning company that operated around the Reno-Carson City Valley, and then he quickly began to try to integrate himself into his local community. Ben would even join a Christian church and become an active participating member. And it didn't take long for Ben to find a woman with whom he had a romantic interest. Her name was Dawn, and she was an attractive young woman who Ben really felt a connection with, and Dawn really felt a connection and really liked Ben as well. So Dawn and Ben were this perfect couple, and they seemed to really hit it off, and before long they were in a very serious relationship. And after about a year of dating, Dawn and Ben would actually get married, and they would have a daughter who they named Alyssa. So for a while, it really seemed like everything was going wonderfully for Ben. He had a wife and he had a young daughter who he loved more than anything else in the entire world, and everything was just really looking up for Ben Oxley. But unfortunately, Ben's relationship with Dawn would ultimately not last. People who knew Dawn would often describe her as somebody who could be very type A personality. She could be very controlling, and she seemed to be the kind of person that always had to have her way. Ben was pretty used to Dawn's personality quirks and her aggressive mood swings, but after a while, Dawn began to take up excessive drinking of alcohol, and she even began to experiment with some recreational drugs. Ben realized that neither he nor Dawn were really very happy in the relationship, and it seemed like their household had become a little bit toxic, and Ben felt like it wasn't a very good environment to raise his daughter Alyssa. You see, from the moment Alyssa was born, Alyssa became Ben's #1 priority in life. Even though Alyssa was only 5 years old at this point, he loved to take her out for picnics, they would go on walks together, and one of their favorite things to do was to have lake days up at Lake Tahoe. And though Ben hated to do it, he would ultimately end up filing for divorce from Dawn, and he would actually move away from her after about 5 years of them being married. And Ben actually took Alyssa with him when he moved out, and while their divorce was being finalized, they settled on a 50-50 custody agreement until the judge could figure out exactly who would get permanent custody of Alyssa. After Ben left her, Dawn was furious and she felt absolutely betrayed by Ben, and this actually caused her to fall into a state of depression, and she ended up drinking more and more alcohol and started experimenting with harder and harder drugs. Of course, Dawn's behavior worried Ben, and he started to think like Dawn has kind of checked out and she really didn't seem like she was showing much interest in being a mother to Alyssa. And naturally, he really didn't want Alyssa spending too much time around Dawn because she felt like Dawn was a negative influence on his 5-year-old daughter. So to make up for the negative influences she was receiving at her mother's house, Ben did everything he could to make sure he was the perfect role model for Alyssa, and he spent every ounce of free time with her. And Ben promised Alyssa, and he promised himself, that he would do absolutely anything he could to gain full custody of Alyssa. And while this child custody case was going on in the background of Ben's life, he would end up meeting another woman named Melissa, who he almost immediately fell in love with. Melissa was a lovely young woman who really seemed to click with Ben and get along perfectly with Alyssa. It had always been a dream of Melissa's to find a husband and to fall in love and to buy a house and have babies and raise a family, and it really seemed like that was kind of what she had found with Ben and Alyssa. And when Ben told Melissa about the child custody case he was going through with Dawn over Alyssa, Melissa did not seem really worried because Ben had clearly created a stable life for Alyssa, and it kind of seemed like Dawn had checked out of being a parent, so she was confident it was just a matter of time that Ben would probably win full custody of his daughter. And Melissa was right. After a long custody battle with Dawn, Ben actually did receive full custody of Alyssa, and she was free to be raised in a kind and loving household with Ben and Melissa. And it seemed like this household really would be healthy and stable, because not long after Ben won full custody of his daughter, Ben would actually ask Melissa to marry him, and she would say yes. So Ben and Melissa actually got married on the shores of Lake Tahoe, and the three of them would officially become a family. And Alyssa would actually take part in the marriage, promising to share in the love of this family forever.
Alyssa, will you promise to share in the love of this family?
So it really did seem like a happily ever after ending. Only it wasn't. It would be 2 short years later, in February of 2008, that our story really begins. On a quiet winter night, the Oxley family were all peacefully asleep in their home in Minden, Nevada. In the quiet home, it was just Ben and Melissa sleeping in the master bedroom, as well as Alyssa sleeping in her room, and across the hall, there was Melissa's brother, Craig, who was falling on hard times and was living with them for the time being. When all of a sudden, Alyssa woke up to the sound of somebody creaking through their house. It sounded like there was somebody walking down past her room through the hallway. And as Alyssa's lying there quietly wondering what these sounds are, she looks over and she sees this shadowy figure slowly creeping into her room. The shadowy figure seemed to poke its head through the door and seemed to look at her for a few seconds before retreating back into the hallway. This unnerved Alyssa because she didn't really know what to make of this shadowy figure, but then she wondered if maybe it was just her mom or dad peeking their head in to check on her and then going back to their room. Maybe they had gone up to get a drink of water. Alyssa was kind of a little bit confused. But as she's lying there quietly with these thoughts going through her mind, she's awakened suddenly by the sound of a shotgun blast that rings out and quite literally shakes the house. Alyssa was terrified when she heard the sound of this gunshot because she didn't really know what to do. She didn't know if there was somebody in the house or what was going on. So Alyssa just lies there quietly for a few minutes wondering what to do when all of a sudden her mother would actually come into her room frantically to pick her up. As Melissa picked up her daughter and carried her out into the living room, she was already on the phone with 911 to report the emergency that had just taken place.
So this gun noise is like a gunshot?
Yeah, I turned up the light to wake up my husband and it was really, really bad.
As Melissa stood there talking on the phone to 911, Alyssa could see that her mother was covered in blood and she was confused about what was going on. And after Alyssa had hung up the phone, she just looked up at her mother and she said, "Where's Daddy? I want to see Daddy." And of course Melissa told her daughter, "We can't see Daddy right now." Within minutes, the police had arrived, and they quickly took count of everything that was in the house. Of course, Melissa and Alyssa were in the living room, and Melissa's brother Craig, who had apparently slept through the entire thing, was still in his bedroom. So the police go into Craig's room and wake him up for questioning, and as they go into the room they see that there's some number 8 birdshot shotgun shells on Craig's dresser, which was the exact kind of ammunition that had just killed Ben. He would say he had absolutely nothing to do with it, and he had apparently slept through the entire encounter, and he offered to let the police check his hands for gunshot residue, and of course they tested his hands and they came back clean, so it was unlikely that Craig had fired a shotgun that night. The police realized that Craig really didn't have very much motive to kill Ben, and since his hands were free of gunshot residue, he was removed as a suspect for the time. And of course, the person that the police most wanted to talk to was Melissa. When it comes to homicide cases involving a husband and a wife, it is not uncommon for the surviving spouse to end up being the culprit. And with Craig not looking like a very viable suspect at this point, and with Alyssa only being about 6 years old at this point, Melissa was the clear primary suspect. And not only that, but Melissa was the only one in the house who had blood all over her, and when they tested her, she was the only one who had gunshot residue on her. Of course, even if Melissa hadn't committed the murder, she could have gotten blood splatter and gunshot residue on her simply by the nature of her being so close to Ben when he got shot by the shotgun. But the fact that nobody else had blood on them or gunshot residue, it seemed like Melissa could have got the blood on her just from standing over Ben when she shot him and got the blood splatter on her that way. But Melissa said that she didn't do it. She said that she didn't even wake up to the sound of the shotgun blast, but she had woken up a few minutes later to the smell of gunpowder, and she had gotten up out of bed and turned on the light and seen that her husband was shot, and then she looked around the house and there was nobody in the house. But her claim was that somebody must have snuck in, shot Ben, and then run away before anybody noticed them. But the police were not very quick to believe Melissa's story. It didn't seem very likely that a killer would come in with a loud weapon like a shotgun, expecting to kill one person and get away clean without waking anybody up. The only other viable suspect who might have a motive to kill Ben was his ex-wife Dawn, who everyone that knew her said that she was very upset that she had lost the child custody case because she did not like having to pay Ben child support every month. But when investigators would interview Dawn regarding this murder, she said that she had been at home that night and of course she had nothing to do with it, and that she had just had a quiet evening and then gone to bed, and her boyfriend at the time, whose name was James, vouched for her and said that he had been with Dawn all night and they had had some drinks together and then they had gone to bed that night. So once again, Melissa rose to the top of the police's suspect list. Even though they didn't have enough evidence to arrest her at the time, they were still keeping a very close eye on her. And in the few months after her husband's murder, Melissa's behavior didn't seem very much like that of a grieving widow. Melissa would actually end up beginning to date another man only a couple months after her husband's murder, and during the same time she attempted to cash out on a $400,000 life insurance policy that she had on her husband Ben. The insurance company actually withheld the payment to Melissa pending the investigation because she was the prime suspect in her husband's murder. And it's probably a pretty well-known fact that life insurance claims are a very common motive for spouse-on-spouse homicide. But in spite of their best efforts, the police were never able to come up with a solid case against Melissa. There were all of these holes in their theory about how Melissa could have committed this murder, such as they found gunshot residue on Melissa, but this could have been explained by either her being the murderer or her just laying next to Ben while somebody else committed the murder. And to further corroborate this, though Melissa had the gunshot residue on her, they never actually found a shotgun at the Oxley house that Melissa could have used to commit the murder. But of course, this could either be because Melissa had committed the murder and then just done a really good job of hiding the murder weapon, or Melissa could be innocent. And with seemingly no answers to all of these many questions that the police had, the case ended up just kind of going cold for more than a year. So the police were kind of left with these two possibilities, where either Melissa had committed seemingly the perfect crime and got away with it, or really a ghost had come into the house, shot Ben, and then got away perfectly clean without waking anybody else up. But during this year, while the police never really came up with enough evidence to arrest or convict Melissa, public opinion was very much against her, and everyone really thought that Melissa had killed her husband for the life insurance money. Ben's daughter, Alyssa, was of course devastated by the loss of her father, and she was so confused not knowing who had come in and who had killed her daddy. But she couldn't help but think that maybe it was that shadowy figure that had come into her room that night. And to make everything even more confusing for her, Child Services actually removed Alyssa from Melissa's care and sent her back to live with her birth mother, Dawn, because Melissa was the primary suspect in this investigation. And Dawn would tell her that her stepmom, who she had grown to love like a mother, was the one who had murdered her father. And that's just how it was for more than a year. Alyssa was in Dawn's custody, and the police's investigation, though they kept on actively pursuing leads, was never really going anywhere, and the case was seemingly going cold. And then, seemingly out of the blue, the police would actually receive a phone call from Dawn, who said that she had been keeping a secret for all of this time, and she wanted to talk. The police were of course interested, and they sent an investigator over to Dawn's house, and when the investigator got there, Dawn had everything worked out. She told the investigators that she knew who had killed Ben and that it wasn't her. But if her story implicated her in any crimes, they had to agree to give her immunity from prosecution in exchange for her testimony. And since the police were pretty much at a loss and this case was going seemingly nowhere, they agreed and gave Dawn immunity from prosecution on the condition that her testimony could contain absolutely no lies or untruthfulness in any way. And if at some point the police were able to prove that Dawn had lied at any point in her testimony, her immunity would be revoked and she could receive prosecution. And Dawn agreed to these terms and said, okay, here's the full story. She told the police that both now at this time and at the time of the murder, she had been dating a man named James Matlin. She told the police that James was the kind of man who was very anxious to make Dawn happy in whatever way he could. He was always buying things for her and doing things for her, and it was really important to James that Dawn was always happy. If you remember from earlier on, many people who knew Dawn described her as the kind of person who could be very manipulative and the kind of person that always had to have her way. So it's hard to say if James was really so anxious to make Dawn happy, or if he was just kind of subservient and Dawn was just able to easily manipulate him into doing anything that she wanted. Dawn told the investigator that on the night that Ben was murdered, her and James had been drinking together and talking and kind of having a quiet evening at home, and Dawn just kind of casually mentioned to James that she really didn't like Ben Oxley, and she didn't think it was fair that she had to pay child support for Alyssa. Dawn told the officer that she had just said these things kind of flippantly, and that she wasn't really meaning anything by it, and she was just kind of venting to her boyfriend. But James, who was pretty intoxicated at this point, seemed to take Dawn's complaints very seriously, and he said, "Do you want me to kill them? Seriously, I'll take care of it tonight." And Dawn of course thought James was kidding, and she said, "Oh no, don't be ridiculous, you're not gonna kill Ben." And then after a few more drinks and some more conversation, Dawn had just gone to bed. And then, a few hours later, in the middle of the night, Dawn said she got a phone call from her boyfriend, and when she picked up the phone to answer it, she just heard James on the other side of the line say, "It's done." And then a few hours later, Dawn would officially find out from police that her ex-husband had been killed. After hearing Dawn's story, the police immediately go out and they track down James Matlin and bring him in for questioning. At first, James would attempt to deny all wrongdoing, saying that he had absolutely nothing to do with the murder of Ben Oxley, but after a bit of questioning and a little bit of prying from the investigators, James would go on to give a full confession. The following is James's account of what actually happened that fateful February night. On the night of February 21st, 2008, James and Dawn had been drinking in their home, just like Dawn had said, when at some point in the evening, Dawn turned to James and expressed to him that she hated Ben and Melissa, and she wished they were dead. She couldn't believe that they got to go off and live a happy life together, while she was stuck living alone and paying child support for her own daughter. And Dawn was getting really worked up at this point, and she was saying, "I wish they were dead. They should be dead. We should go kill them." And James agreed. So James and Dawn got in a car and they drove over to Ben and Melissa's house. Dawn got out of the car and she showed James how to get into Ben's house and showed him where the master bedroom was and how to get inside. Once the two of them were in the house, James starts to creep down the hallway into Ben and Melissa's room, and as he's doing so, Dawn is behind him and she starts to slowly open the door to Alyssa's room and peek her head inside. That shadowy figure that Alyssa had seen slowly poke its head into her room and wait a few seconds and then back away had actually been her birth mother, Dawn. As Dawn was going into Alyssa's room, James looks back and he stops her and says, "What are you doing?" And Dawn said, "You go in and kill Ben and Melissa. I'm going to take my daughter back." But James told her, "No, you can't do that. If you take Alyssa, the police are going to find her, and then they're going to know it was us who committed the murders." And he told Dawn, "Once we get away with the murders, child services are likely to just give you Alyssa later." And as we know, that's exactly what happened. So Dawn stopped going into Alyssa's room, and she slowly closed the door and backed out into the hallway, and then the two of them walked back towards Ben and Melissa's room. And then James went into the master bedroom where Ben and Melissa were still fast asleep, and he raised his shotgun and put it a couple inches away from Ben's head. And as James was in that room with the gun up to Ben's head, all of these thoughts start going through his head, and he starts thinking, "What am I doing here? I can't do this. I shouldn't be here." And as he was standing there, almost motionless for a couple seconds with all of these thoughts going through his head, he hears Dawn behind him whisper, "What are you waiting for?" And when James heard the sound of Dawn's voice behind him, he was a little bit startled and he jerked around to look at Dawn, but as his hand shook when he heard her voice, the gun just went off. And just like that, Ben Oxley was killed suddenly in his sleep. Horrified at what he had just done, James picks up the gun and he starts to walk out of the room, but Dawn stops him and says, wait, aren't you going to kill Melissa?" But James is just too freaked out and he said, "No, I'm not. We have to get out of here. We have to leave. This was a mistake. We need to get out of here now." So the two of them just turned and walked out of the house, and then they quietly drove off into the night. After taking James's confession, the police would obviously arrest him and charge him with the murder of Ben Oxley, and James Matlin would ultimately be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But of course, the police couldn't go back and arrest Dawn for her part in the crime because she had already been granted immunity for turning in her boyfriend. Ultimately, it was just Dawn's story against James's, and there was no real way to prove definitely who was telling the truth. It does seem like James's story is the more likely account, because aside from Dawn's manipulation, James would have no reason to kill Ben. And everybody who knew Dawn would go on to say, if Dawn wasn't happy, nobody was happy. She could be a very manipulative person. And also, James's account is the only version of events that explains that shadowy figure that crept into Alyssa's room. But regardless, Dawn was never arrested or held accountable in any way for the murder of Ben Oxley, and Melissa would go on to say that that was very difficult for her. Melissa would eventually regain custody of her stepdaughter Alyssa, and the two of them must just now find a way to live, knowing that Dawn will probably never be held accountable for Ben's death. There you have it, guys. Thank you for watching another episode of Storyvolt. Please let me know what you thought of this case down in the comments. Do you think that James was telling the truth about Dawn? Whose story seems more likely to you? For more strange cases and stories like this one, go ahead and click on one of these two videos here. And hey, feel free to subscribe. That's it for today. I'll see you guys soon, but until then, be safe out there.